hafrada. The word hafrada in Hebrew means segregation, which is ironically the same word that the Afrikaners used in South Africa. Apartheid, which also means segregation in English. There's an international convention against the crime of apartheid, and Israel fulfills every one of its criteria. This village, Al-Walaja, which I take visitors to near Bethlehem, between the Green Line and the wall, is slated for demolition. It's actually already 33 houses were destroyed in the village of Al-Walaja. Al-Walaja was completely destroyed in 1948, and Israel occupied all its areas here in 1948. Jordan came to control this part, and the villagers rebuilt their village here, a new village of Al-Walaja. Israel now wants to destroy this new village of Al-Walaja and is slowly actually destroying it as we speak. So this is pictures from the destruction of the houses in Al-Walaja. House demolitions in the West Bank continue. Last week there were several houses and structures destroyed in East Jerusalem and the rest of the West Bank. This is not a new policy. As I mentioned, about the 530 villages and towns that were destroyed, and more in 1967, and more since then actually have been destroyed. Just in the past 9 years, over 25,000 homes have been destroyed. There has been also, to build the wall, Israel uprooted, destroyed over 1.5 million fruiting trees, including these olive trees you see on the left. These olive trees, we call them in Arabic zitun rumani, or Rumi, meaning that it goes back to the time of the Romans, over 2,000 years old olive trees. And of course, this is not just in the West Bank and Gaza. As you know, also inside the Green Line, or inside the areas that Israel controlled before 1967. This is pictures from a village called Al-Araqib in the Negev, which was destroyed 7 times already. The last was two or three weeks ago, I think. And these are pictures from the images of the families in Al-Araqib as they watched their houses destroyed in the Negev. Of course, Palestinians engage in nonviolent resistance against these practices. This is from Al-Walaja, where this is Omar and his 2 children sitting in front of a bulldozer as it's uprooting the trees of the family. My book, as I mentioned, is titled Popular Resistance in Palestine. It just came out in English, and it will be out in Arabic in a few weeks and in other languages soon, including French and Spanish. But I want to just say a few words about this, because there's a lot of misperception, especially in the West, where the media is very much controlled, where the media tries to portray Palestinians as terrorists, that we Palestinians do not differ from anybody else. We are just like the South Africans, just like the Algerians, just like the Vietnamese, just like any other, the Indians under British rule. There's always a spectrum of resistance. Some resistance is violent, which is, by the way, justified by international law. International law is very clear about the right of people occupied, colonized, to resist. Actually, international law says by any means necessary. But of course, also people resist by nonviolent methods. And my book traces 130 years of nonviolent resistance to or popular resistance to Zionism. Starting in the late 19th century, actually, I found that the first demonstration occurred near Jaffa in 1881 against a new settlement called Petah Tikva, the first Zionist settlement in Palestine. So actually 130 years of nonviolent resistance. These are leaders of nonviolent resistance in the 19th century. These are Palestinian women in 1929 who held the Congress of Palestinian Women in Jerusalem. And the Palestinian women then made a demonstration in the streets of Jerusalem where they had actually 120 cars beeping their horns in the old city of Jerusalem. In 1929, it's a miracle to have 120 cars in one demonstration. Of course, cars are new. But they also went and met with the British High Commissioner. You can see them, the executive committee of this Palestinian Women Congress in front of the door of the High Commissioner with the British soldier there. And they tried to insist, why do you want to do this? Why do you want to change what is a multi-ethnic, multi-religious society to make it into a state for the Jewish people instead of a state for all the people that live here? These are religious leaders in 1932 Palestine, meeting again and leading nonviolent resistance. Some of these leaders ended up in British jails. This is in a British jail in 1936 for Muslim leaders to Christian leaders. We must also remind ourselves that when we even talk about the PLO in the 1960s and the 1970s, maybe some of you remember the PLO for things like maybe airplane hijacking or the Munich attacks or something like that. But really the PLO was a very diverse, big group of, it's not really an organization, it's a network. And this PLO included within it, for example, as you see here, General Union of Palestinian Workers, General Union of Palestinian Women, engineers, students, writers. All of these people were engaged in popular forms of resistance. Yes, there were the guerrilla groups, and they were doing, as I said, per international law, legitimate acts of resistance against colonial occupation. And some of them went into other areas and extreme areas, but there were very, very few of those individuals. In the 1980, there were actually, I counted approximately, depending on how you measure, between 13 and 18 uprisings. An uprising in colonial struggles, of course, uprisings do not come suddenly. There's waves of resistance, so the wave comes and goes. And every between 7 years to 15 years, we have had a Palestinian uprising. For example, 1920, 21, 1929, 1936, and so on. And these uprisings have characteristics that in the beginning, the year before, I actually studied the year before an uprising to see these characteristics, and I predict an uprising based on this history that there's going to be an uprising in 2011, 2012 at the latest. But the 1987 uprising is the one that most people here maybe are familiar with that, called Intifada, but there were, as I said, many other uprisings before it. But these are the characteristics that occur just before an uprising, and we see the characteristics repeat themselves before every uprising in Palestine. Now the next few pictures just illustrate forms of Palestinian popular resistance. These girls, when they go to school, by the way, they are engaged in nonviolent resistance when they have to do this to get to their school. These are all forms of popular resistance. These are some Palestinian leaders I consider analogous to Mahatma Gandhi, Martin Luther King, Desmond Tutu, but you won't see them in Western media, of course. But I must emphasize that for us to exist on this land is to resist. And this is what's written on the wall here. To exist is to resist. Because even picking olives when the Israeli soldiers and army and settlers do not want us to do that, this is a form of resistance. Israel's Zionist project was interested in, as Ilan argues in his book, of course, is in removal of the maximum number of Palestinians from their land. So for us to stay on the land, the fact that there's 5.5 million Palestinians today between the River Jordan and the Mediterranean is not a coincidence. The fact that we exist there, the fact that I live there, that I teach there, is thanks much to the resistance of my ancestors who managed to stay on the land. So everything we do, when we eat, when we drink, when we go to school, all of these things are forms of resistance. When this shepherd woman takes her sheep to pasture, she is engaged in nonviolent resistance. These few pictures here are from my friend Anna Baltzar, who's a Jewish American, wrote a book about Palestinian experiences, and she gave me permission to use these pictures in the CD that will accompany the book that I just published. But the shepherd woman continued to go to the field even when the settlers went to the extreme of putting poison pellets, you see on the left, to try and poison her sheep so that she will have no reason to go to the land. And yet she continues to go to the land to pick up these poison pellets and feed her sheep. When these girls go to school in Bethlehem like this is just a few years ago, or these girls in Hebron try to get to school, the soldier prevents them, and they sit in the street and have their class in the street. This is nonviolent or popular resistance. When these Muslims are praying on their land for the last time, maybe before the land is taken from them, this is non-violent or popular resistance. All these are forms of popular and non-violent resistance. It fulfills every one of its criteria. This village, Al-Walaja, which I take visitors to near Bethlehem, between the green line and the wall, is slated for demolition. It's actually already 33 now wants to destroy this new village of Al-Walaja and is slowly actually destroying it as we speak. So this is pictures from the destruction of the houses in Al-Walaja. House demolitions in the West Bank continue. Last week there were several houses and structures destroyed in East Jerusalem and the rest of the West Bank. This is not a new policy, as I mentioned, about the 530 villages and towns that were destroyed, and more in 1967, and more since then actually have been destroyed. Just in the past 9 years, over 25,000 homes have been destroyed. 3 houses were destroyed in the village of Al-Walaja. Al-Walaja was completely destroyed in 1948, and Israel occupied all its areas here in 1948. Jordan came to control this part, and the villagers rebuilt their village here, a new village of Al-Walaja. Israel Hafrada. The word Hafrada in Hebrew means segregation, which is ironically the same word that the Afrikaners used in South Africa. Apartheid, which also means segregation in English. There's an international convention against the crime of apartheid, and Israel